often look for danger in dark alleys or abandoned, crumbling houses. We don't expect it to be lurking inside a brightly lit, high-end commercial establishment downtown, wrapped in the scent of expensive shampoos and high-end perfumes. I thought the crushing fatigue and memory lapses I experienced at my new job were just the result of burnout. I didn't know that the owner was using an aggressive, blood-fed commercial binding curse to siphon the life force of his employees just to keep his registers full. The job offer felt like a massive stroke of luck during a year when my finances were starting to tighten. My name is Chloe, and after a brief, stressful stint working freelance, I managed to land a high-paying position as the general floor manager for a highly prestigious boutique hair salon located in the wealthy historical district downtown. The facade of the building was stunning. Polished floor-to-ceiling glass windows, minimalist white marble counters, and a steady stream of elite, high-paying metropolitan clients. The neighborhood itself was vibrant, lined with historic brick architecture and massive oak trees. But the moment you stepped past the threshold of the salon, the air felt strangely dense. It carried a heavy, chemical-laden chill from the industrial air conditioning units that never seemed to turn off, mixed with an underlying, unnatural quietness that seemed to swallow the hum of the hair dryers. Initially, I shrugged off the uneasy vibe. The paycheck was incredible, and my responsibilities were straightforward. But by the end of my first week, a subtle, alarming toxicity began to invade my physical body. It started with a chronic, localized pressure right behind my eyes. It wasn't a sharp pain, but a heavy, throbbing fog that settled over my brain within an hour of clocking in. At first, I rationalized it. I blamed the pungent chemical fumes of bleaching powders, ammonia, and organic hair dyes that saturated the air. I assumed my eyes were simply adjusting to the harsh, fluorescent lighting, or that the blast of cold air was triggering a sinus infection. I tried drinking more water and taking over-the-counter pain relievers, but nothing touched the fog. To protect myself from negative energy, I had always worn a specific personal amulet, a heavy, raw, citrine quartz crystal pendant suspended from a silver chain around my neck. I was deeply attached to it. I spent months treating it under the moonlight and infusing it with clear intentions. It had always served as a grounding mechanism for my anxiety. But about 2 months into my employment at the salon, I took the chain off before hopping into a deep hot shower at home. I placed it carefully on my nightstand. The next morning, the citrine pendant was completely gone. My boyfriend and I spent 3 hours tearing my bedroom apart. We lifted the massive mattress, swept beneath the heavy dresser, unbolted the baseboards, and scanned every single corner with high-powered flashlights. The crystal had completely vanished into thin air, as if it had been dissolved by an invisible hand. Without the protective weight of that crystal against my chest, the atmosphere inside the salon became an absolute psychological prison. My work shift spanned from exactly 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., and within those 9 hours, I experienced a terrifying, systemic decay of my cognitive functions. Like clockwork, at precisely 11 a.m. every morning, a wave of catastrophic, unnatural drowsiness would wash over me. My mind would turn completely muddled and sluggish, my limbs feeling like lead weights. It felt exactly as if I had consumed an entire case of heavy beer on an empty stomach. I couldn't process simple client invoices, and my short-term memory completely disintegrated. The most disturbing part was the timing. This overwhelming, zombie-like stupor would paralyze me all day, but the exact second the sun slipped below the horizon, around 5:30 or 6 p.m., a literal physical snap would occur in my brain. The drowsiness would instantly vanish, the headache would evaporate, and I would suddenly become wide awake and sharp-minded for the final hour of my shift. Outside of work, my personality began to warp. I became irrationally hostile, cussing and snapping at my boyfriend over trivial things, my temper flaring into blinding rages for no justifiable reason. My life was perfectly stable, my income was great, and my relationship was solid, yet my internal baseline was rotting from the inside out. I thought I was just losing my mind until a junior apprentice at the salon pulled me into the break room, her hand shaking as she held a cup of tea. She was a hypersensitive, timid girl who had a notorious reputation among the staff for being incredibly weak-vied, meaning she easily absorbed the negative frequencies of her surroundings. "Chloe, there's something wrong with this floor," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the security cameras. "I keep seeing shadow figures out of the corner of my eye, mimicking the movements of the stylists. I feel like the walls are actively draining us." Desperate for protection, the apprentice had traveled to her remote, deeply superstitious rural hometown over the weekend to consult an elder, returning with a blessed wooden charm wrapped around her ankle. But the spiritual blowback was instantaneous. On her very first drive home after wearing the ankle charm to work, she was navigating a completely empty, flat stretch of road when her motorbike's steering mechanism unexpectedly locked up. She told me she felt a violent, invisible force physically grab her handlebars and wrench them sideways, flipping the heavy bike over and causing a horrific crash that left her severely injured. A week later, the entity inside the building dropped its mask entirely. It was roughly 8 p.m. on a stormy Thursday evening. The salon had closed, and the apprentice, along with a senior stylist, were upstairs in the narrow corridor, carrying heavy hampers of stained towels to the laundry room. As they walked up the stairs, they both clearly saw the elderly evening security guard walking rigidly up the steps ahead of them, cradling his large black cat in his arms. "Hey, heading up to lock the roof early tonight?" the senior stylist called out. The guard didn't flinch. He didn't turn his head. He kept walking with an unnaturally stiff, wooden gait, staring straight ahead into the darkness. He reached the top landing, turned a sharp left, and walked directly into a dead-end maintenance corridor. 2 minutes later, while the girls were still sorting the laundry, they walked back down the exact same stairwell, only to see the exact same elderly security guard, cradling the exact same black cat, walking up the steps for a second time. "Wait," the apprentice stammered, a cold sweat breaking across her neck. "We just saw you go upstairs 2 minutes ago. When did you come back down?" The security guard stopped, looking at them with a mixture of confusion and absolute terror. "What are you talking about? I've been locked inside the glass security booth downstairs for the last 3 hours monitoring the parking gate. I haven't stepped foot near this stairwell all night." When the apprentice retold the story to me the next morning, the lingering veil over my mind finally tore open. I immediately booked an emergency appointment with an intuitive spiritual consultant outside the city. The moment I sat down in his quiet office, before I could even open my mouth to explain my symptoms, the consultant raised his hand, gesturing for me to be silent. He laid out a sequence of dark cards on the table, his expression turning deeply grim. "You are caught in a commercial crossfire," he stated bluntly, looking directly into my hollow eyes. "The owner of that salon isn't just a businessman. He is actively practicing an aggressive, high-stakes wealth-binding ritual. He has bound a predatory entity to that commercial space to draw in elite clients and maximize cash flow. But an entity like that requires a heavy toll. It feeds on the raw vitality and cognitive energy of the people trapped inside the building for hours at a time. Your natural baseline is violently clashing with the resident's spirit. It is systematically draining your life force to fuel his profits. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I rushed back to the salon that afternoon with newly opened eyes. While the floor was empty, I stepped behind the main reception desk and dropped to my knees to inspect the commercial shrine the owner had set up beneath the counter. Hidden directly behind the standard decorative pieces was a gleaming gold four-faced figure, and tucked right next to it was a tiny, grotesque, unidentifiable stone effigy covered in a layer of rancid, sticky oils. I began quietly questioning some of the senior stylists who had been there for years. They reluctantly confirmed my suspicions, whispering that 3 or 4 times every single year, like absolute clockwork, the owner would suddenly abandon the business. Even during critical tax audits or legal disputes, he would drop everything to board a sudden flight to Thailand, disappearing into the rural districts for weeks at a time to renew his contracts and recharge the effigies. I handed in my resignation that very evening, refusing to spend another hour inside that polished marble trap. The physical recovery was instantaneous. The day after I walked out of the salon for the last time, the crushing headaches vanished. My mental clarity snapped back to perfect precision, and the irrational anger in my blood completely dissolved. A week later, my boyfriend and I decided to do a deep therapeutic cleaning of our townhouse to purge any residual energy. I pulled open a small built-in drawer near the baseboards of my bed frame, a spot we had checked 100 times with flashlights. Resting perfectly in the center of the clean wood was my missing citrine quartz pendant. I have a normal office job now, miles away from the downtown core, and my life has settled back into a peaceful, quiet routine. But occasionally, my commute forces me to drive past the historic district where the boutique salon still operates. The business is more successful than ever. The marble floors gleam, and the parking lot is permanently packed with luxury vehicles. But sometimes, when the car is stopped at the red light outside, I catch a glimpse of the owner standing near the glass facade. His skin has turned a hollow, grayish color, and his eyes have shifted into a sharp, slanted, predatory squint. The entity is slowly consuming him from the inside out. I roll up my windows and step on the gas, haunted by the terrifying realization of what truly fuels the glittering spaces we blindly enter, and the freezing knowledge that some people are entirely willing to feed the minds of their workers to the shadows, just to keep the gold flowing in. They tell us that dreams are just random firings of a tired brain, subconscious noise clearing out the psychological debris of our day. But what happens when your mind stops looking backward and starts acting like an active broadcast window into the immediate future? I used to ignore the strange, vivid sequences that played behind my eyelids. Now, every single time a minor detail from a nightmare bleeds into my waking life, a freezing dread takes over my chest, because I know someone is about to die. The phenomenon didn't manifest as a sudden, dramatic haunting. It crept into my life slowly, disguised as simple coincidence before turning into an absolute psychological prison. My name is Hazel, and up until the spring of 2024, I considered myself an entirely ordinary student. I didn't see cold shadows lingering in the corners of my room, and I didn't believe in local urban legends. But during the late April holidays, my mother planned a sudden trip to visit her estranged family upstate. We were traveling to an isolated rural farming county that I had never stepped foot in before, specifically to stay at the historic estate of my maternal grandaunt, a woman who had passed away long before I was born, leaving her property to my living relatives. The night before we were scheduled to drive out to the remote property, we stayed at a quiet, wood-paneled guest house a few miles outside the county lines. The night air was thick and heavy with the scent of upcoming rain. I fell asleep early, expecting a deep, restorative rest, but instead slipped into a terrifyingly lucid dream. In the dream, I was walking down a long, completely unpaved gravel driveway flanked by ancient, overgrown pine trees. At the end of the path stood a massive, weathered, two-story Victorian farmhouse. The white paint was peeling, and the structure felt entirely abandoned. I walked up the 3 creaking wooden steps onto the wraparound porch and pushed the heavy oak front door open. Inside the house was drowning in absolute silence. In the exact center of the dusty main room sat a dark, rustic wooden dining set. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, I walked past the chairs and looked up at the brick fireplace mantelpiece. Hanging directly over the dark wood cabinet was a massive, ornate vintage picture frame. Inside was a black and white portrait of an elderly woman dressed in a heavy, high-collared, dark lace gown. The woman's features were strikingly familiar. She possessed the exact sharp jawline and deep-set eyes of my late grandmother, but her expression in the photograph was intensely cold, staring right through me. The sheer, suffocating intensity of her gaze made me jolt upright in pitch-black darkness, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I broke through the surface of the nightmare. The next morning, the lingering dread of the dream refused to fade as my mother and I drove deep into the countryside. The roads grew progressively rougher, turning into muddy gravel tracks surrounded by dense, encroaching woods. When my mother finally pulled the car up to my aunt's property, my breath caught in my throat. There was no unpaved driveway, but standing directly in front of me was the exact, weathered, 2-story Victorian farmhouse from my dream. My legs felt like lead weights as I followed my mother up the 3 wooden porch steps. We stepped into the main living space. The air inside smelled faintly of old paper and copper. And there, sitting in the exact center of the room, was the rustic wooden dining set. Trembling, my eyes slowly drifted up toward the brick fireplace mantelpiece. Hanging directly on the wall was the massive, ornate vintage frame. Inside was the black and white portrait of my maternal grandaunt, wearing the high-collared dark lace gown, staring down at me with the exact icy expression I had witnessed behind my eyelids just hours before. I had never seen a single photograph of this woman in my entire life. Yet my subconscious had mapped her face and her home with clinical precision. I kept the terrifying realization to myself, trying to convince my mind that it was just a bizarre trick of déjà vu. But the anomaly returned with an absolute vengeance in December of 2025. We were back in our quiet suburban neighborhood. 3 houses down from our driveway lived an elderly neighbor. She was an exceptionally frail woman who hadn't stepped foot outside her home for the past 6 or 7 years due to severe, failing health. But among the local kids, she possessed a lingering reputation for being fiercely, aggressively strict. During my childhood, if any of us so much as stepped a single inch onto her manicured lawn or made too much noise near her porch, she would violently swing her door open and cuss us off her property. Her image was burned into my memory. She always wore a pristine, stark white silk cardigan, thick wire-rimmed glasses, and carried her head at a stiff, proud angle. On a bitterly cold Tuesday night, I fell into another deep sleep and found myself standing on my own front porch in a dream. The suburban street was completely deserted, cast in a dim amber glow from the flickering street lamps. As I watched, the front door of the elderly neighbor's house slowly swung wide open. Out stepped the old woman. She wasn't carrying a cane. and she didn't look frail at all. She was dressed in her signature pristine white silk cardigan and thick wire-rimmed glasses, but her expression of bitter anger was entirely gone. Her face looked completely serene, almost translucent under the street lights. She walked down her concrete steps, stepped onto the sidewalk, and began marching slowly toward my house. She passed the neighboring yards, turned up my driveway, and walked directly toward my front porch. She didn't knock. She simply glided straight through our locked front door, stepping into the dark hallway where I sleep, before vanishing into the shadows. I jolted awake with an intense wave of cold sweat plastering my hair to my forehead. The clock read 6:30 a.m. The dream left a heavy, suffocating weight in the center of my chest all morning. As I walked down the street to catch the transit bus for school, I intentionally glanced at her house. The blinds were drawn tight, and the porch light was still humming in the gray morning fog. When I returned home from my lectures later that afternoon, my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. An ambulance and a coroner's van were parked directly outside her house, their strobe lights painting the brick walls in rhythmic flashes of red and blue. A small crowd of quiet neighbors had gathered near the property line. My mother walked out to meet me, her face pale. She whispered that the elderly neighbor's caretaker had gone in to check on her that morning and found that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep somewhere in the dead of night. I still walk past that quiet, empty house 3 doors down every single day on my commute. The manicured lawn is starting to become overgrown, and the windows remain dark. I don't see apparitions pacing through the rooms, and I don't hear disembodied whispers in the night. But what completely terrifies me is the structural mapping of my own mind. I am haunted by the image of that old woman in the white cardigan silently stepping through my front door hours before her body went cold. I live in a constant state of exhausting paranoia now, because every single night, when I close my eyes and the darkness rolls in, I am terrified of what my brain is going to broadcast next, and the freezing knowledge that the next time I recognize a strange face standing at the foot of my bed, it means their time has already run out. They say our minds play tricks on us when we're exhausted. But what happens when the trick isn't a trick at all, but a localized broadcast from a tragedy that hasn't happened yet? I used to think dreams were just noise. Now, every single time I close my eyes, I'm terrified of what I'll find printed on the next page. Because some warnings are written in blood before the clock even strikes the hour. It was Tuesday night, May 17th. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the open closet door, dealing with that mundane, everyday dilemma that every college student faces before a long week. What am I going to wear tomorrow? Our university campus was a massive, sprawling concrete labyrinth of brutalist architecture, and my academic schedule for the upcoming days was completely punishing. Looking at my syllabus, Thursday was going to be an absolute nightmare. 12 straight hours of back-to-back lectures and laboratory sessions spanning from dawn until well after dark. I knew I would need my most comfortable, durable clothes for that physical marathon, so I mentally reserved my usual go-to outfit, a pair of worn dark jeans and a simple black t-shirt. That left Wednesday, May 18th. As I reached for a casual flannel shirt, a completely inexplicable, anomalous thought popped into my head out of nowhere. Why not go full white? It wasn't my style at all. I rarely wore monochrome outfits, let alone a stark, bright, clinical white. But the idea stuck in my mind like a stubborn, burning itch that I couldn't scratch. Yielding to the strange urge, I pulled out a crisp white shirt and a pair of matching white denim pants. I laid them out carefully over the back of my desk chair, flipped off the light switch, and crawled under the covers, expecting a normal, restful night of sleep before my morning classes. Instead, the moment my eyes closed, I fell into the most suffocatingly vivid, hyper-realistic nightmare I have ever experienced in my life. In the dream, I was already at school. I was walking down the long, sweeping interior corridor of Building B, heading directly toward the upper balconies of the 10th floor. I was wearing the exact all-white monochrome outfit I had just laid out hours prior, the crisp white shirt, the matching white pants, reflecting the cold light of the building. But something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the physical reality of the campus. The sprawling hallways were completely, utterly deserted. There were no echoing footsteps, no distant murmurs of students gossiping between classes, no rustling of papers or slamming of locker doors. There was only a heavy, suffocatingly dead silence that pressed painfully against my eardrums like deep underwater pressure. Yet, the moment I glanced out the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows down into the central concrete courtyard, my breath caught in my throat. Thousands of tiny, indistinct shapes were swarming below. A massive, silent crowd of students and faculty members had gathered in the plaza, pacing around in erratic, panicked circles like ants in a violently disturbed nest. Every single person below was staring fixedly down at something hidden from my high vantage point. I felt a sudden, freezing draft hit the back of my neck as I continued walking down the dark hall. The air grew rapidly thin, smelling faintly of old, decaying paper and metallic copper. Driven by a hollow sense of purpose, I kept moving forward until I reached the heavy wooden door of the exact lecture hall where my Wednesday morning class was scheduled to take place. Right as my hand reached out to grasp the metal door handle, the empty air to my immediate left seemed to warp and ripple like liquid glass. Out of thin air, a long, pitch-black arm materialized out of the empty space, violently jutting out across the frame to block my path. It didn't look human at all. The skin was a charred, oil-slick black, completely devoid of pores or texture, aggressively absorbing the dim fluorescent lighting of the corridor. I couldn't see a body or a face, but the sheer, towering scale and angles of the limb made me instinctively realize it belonged to a massive, malevolent male presence standing just beyond the invisible veil of my waking world. My breath trapped itself in my throat. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move a single muscle. Clutched tightly in those dark, shadowy fingers was a thick, manila file folder, the exact kind used by the university administration for official student background dossiers or academic resumes. The arm held the folder perfectly flat, presenting it to me like a silent, unyielding command. Driven by a sudden wave of pure, unadulterated dread, my hands began moving entirely on their own. I reached out and took the heavy folder from the blackened fingers. The exact millisecond the paper left its grip, the arm dissolved back into the empty air, vanishing into the shadows. Somehow, without any transition, the scene violently shifted. I was sitting quietly at my usual desk inside the completely empty classroom. The manila folder sat heavily on the wooden surface in front of me. With trembling, numb fingers, I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was completely sterilely blank, just a pre-printed template with empty boxes intended for names, dates, and residential addresses. I turned to the second page. My heart completely stopped. Printed directly in the upper left corner of the document was a standard passport-style identification photo. It showed a young guy, clearly a student at our college. He possessed remarkably pale skin and noticeably round, soft, almost boyish cheeks, but it was the text printed next to the photograph that made the hair on my arms stand up. His full name was printed in massive, bold, jet black letters. I stared at the characters, syllable by syllable, memorizing the specific sequence of the name. It was a name I had never heard spoken before in my entire life. A complete and utter stranger. As I sat there, paralyzed with confusion, trying to comprehend why this stranger's file had been handed to me by a supernatural anomaly, a sudden ice-cold breath brushed directly against my left ear. A distorted, hollow, multi-layered female voice whispered a single sentence into the dark room. "Go home. Go home to your mother." The words hit my consciousness like a physical blow. I jolted violently upright in bed, my eyes flying open as I broke through the suffocating surface of the nightmare. I was back in my actual bedroom. The air conditioner was humming quietly in the corner, but I was absolutely drenched in a thick sheet of cold sweat, my chest heaving in ragged, desperate gasps. I frantically grabbed my phone from the nightstand to check the time. The digital clock read 9:15 a.m. A wave of pure panic immediately replaced the lingering dread in my state of exhaustion. I had completely forgotten to activate my morning alarm. My first lecture had started 15 minutes ago on the opposite side of town. I threw off the damp sheets, grabbed the first random set of dark clothes I could find from the floor, completely forgetting about the white monochrome outfit on the chair, and rushed out the door, sprinting wildly toward the transit station. But as I navigated the crowded, noisy morning commute, the dream absolutely refused to fade. Usually, nightmares dissolve within minutes of waking up, leaving only a vague, hazy aftertaste of fear. This one was different. The pale boy's face, his round cheeks, his neutral gaze, was burned into my retinas like a flashbulb memory. The bold letters of his strange name kept replaying in my mind on a continuous, agonizing loop. I felt entirely disconnected from the reality of the crowded train, like a ghost walking blindly among the living. When I finally reached the brutalist concrete campus, the atmosphere felt incredibly heavy and oppressive. I dragged my feet into the lecture hall, sitting near the back, but I couldn't focus on a single word. The professor's voice sounded like underwater white noise, completely distorted and incomprehensible. My mind was entirely consumed by a heavy, sinking premonition that something catastrophic was about to drop into my life. By midday, our class shifted over to the 10th floor of Building A for a specialized seminar. I sat near the back row, staring blankly out the window across the narrow concrete courtyard toward the parallel balcony of Building B. Suddenly, the classmate sitting right next to me let out a sharp, muffled gasp. I turned to look at her. Her face had gone completely pale, her eyes wide with absolute shock as she stared down at her phone screen. "Maya," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard I could barely make out the words. "Maya, oh my God, a student just jumped." The entire room seemed to instantly lose its color. "What?" I stammered, my stomach dropping into a bottomless void. "What do you mean?" She silently angled her screen toward me. It was a private student group chat where someone on a lower floor had snapped a hasty, blurred photograph before the campus security could lock down the perimeter. The image was graphic, a terrifying, violent splash of reality against the cold gray concrete below. The user who sent it deleted the file almost instantly out of fear of administrative backlash and suspension. But those 2 seconds were enough for me to process the details. Based on the angle of the courtyard and the layout of the concrete barriers, the student had fallen from the 10th floor balcony of Building B. It was the exact building, the exact floor. and the exact physical location from my nightmare the night before. I looked out the window, my vision blurring. The balcony overlooked a narrow patch of open courtyard, right next to the campus edge where a forgotten, overgrown, empty field stretched out into the distance. A barren plot of land filled with historical, unmarked graves. Within minutes, the entire lecture hall erupted into a frenzy of hushed, terrified murmurs and crying. The professor tried desperately to restore order, commanding everyone to remain in their seats. But the news was spreading through local social media feeds like wildfire. When the administration finally announced a brief recess to clear the upper floors, I walked out into the hallway to get a drink of water, my legs feeling like heavy columns of lead. All the emergency exit doors leading to the balconies and windows facing that side of the courtyard had been locked down and covered by security guards. But from a distance, looking down through a glass partition, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles and a massive crowd of administrators gathering around a white sheet on the concrete below. On my long, silent way home that afternoon, my mind began frantically stitching the horrific pieces together. The intense dread, the monochrome outfit, the 10th floor, the name. It was too hyper-specific to be a mere coincidence. The next morning, the official, redacted news whispered through the student body. The grim details were finally confirmed by the local police report. It was a young male student. On the morning of the tragedy, he had been wearing a light shirt and dark pants. His physical build matched the description perfectly. With a tight knot of pure terror tightening in my stomach, I cautiously approached a mutual friend who worked with the student union administration and asked if they had seen the official identification paperwork of the boy. I didn't give the full name from my dream. I only asked one specific, terrifying question. Did his first name start with the letter N? My friend stopped dead in her tracks, looking at me with an expression of complete, startled bewilderment. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice shaking. "How the hell did you know that, Maya? The family asked for privacy. They haven't released his name to the public yet." I couldn't answer her. I just turned around and walked away into the fog, the cold sweat returning to my palms. I still go to classes every single day on that brutalist campus. I am forced to pass by Building B every morning, and every single time I look up at the 10th floor balcony fading into the gray, overcast sky, my stomach violently turns. I'm not afraid of local urban legends, and I'm not afraid of the cold concrete halls. What utterly terrifies me is the structural mapping of my own mind. I keep thinking about that pitch-black, charred arm reaching out from the empty air, handing me a stranger's life file hours before it was permanently closed. Was it a manifestation of death itself? And if it happens again, whose face will be printed on the second page next time? We find comfort in setting up memorials for our late relatives, believing that their spirits rest peacefully in the afterlife, entirely cut off from the worlds they left behind. But we forget that the dead retain their old networks, their old duties, and their old promises. I thought our vast, quiet colonial house was completely isolated from the outside world. I didn't know that my late uncle was calling his long-dead companions back to our property, turning our back door into a literal gateway for a midnight roll call. The house was a sprawling, historic colonial-style estate located in a secluded rural county upstate, surrounded by miles of dense pine woods and rolling hills. My name is Claire, and our family had lived on the property for generations. Because the estate was massive, it had been structurally partitioned into two separate residential wings, the spacious front wing where my grandmother and I lived, and an extended, older, wood-paneled rear annex. My sister and her husband occupied the quiet rear annex. Her husband had deep ancestral roots on the East Coast, coming from a prominent military family with a long history of service. In the living room of their wing, they kept a beautifully maintained dark oak memorial mantelpiece dedicated entirely to his late father, Arthur. The mantel was lined with vintage black and white photographs, rows of shiny silver combat medals, and old leather-bound journals from his time in the service. The transition between the modern front wing and the heavily shaded, creaking rear annex always felt chillingly abrupt. At night, the long connecting corridor would trap the cold air, leaving an unsettling, heavy silence that made you pick up your pace whenever you walked through it. It was a bitterly cold, stormy night in mid-November. I was deeply asleep in my bedroom when a sudden, violent sound forcibly dragged my consciousness out of sleep. Bam, 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 bam. My eyes snapped open. I lay perfectly rigid beneath the heavy blankets, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, relentless, incredibly frantic pounding coming from the lower level of the rear annex, specifically against the heavy oak cellar door that opened directly onto the dark gravel yard and the dense woods behind our house. The pounding was desperate, loud, and erratic, sounding exactly like a group of people stranded in a freezing blizzard, frantically begging for immediate shelter before they succumbed to the elements. Thud, 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 thud. The heavy wooden beams of the floorboard seemed to vibrate from the immense force, driven by a combination of intense adrenaline and fear that a neighbor or a stranded motorist was in severe distress outside. I grabbed a flashlight, wrapped a thick wool blanket over my shoulders, and quietly slipped out of my room. I hurried down the long, freezing connecting corridor, stepping into the dark kitchen of the rear annex. The metal lock on the back door was actively rattling and jiggling inside its brass housing from the external pounding. I took a deep breath, threw back the heavy iron deadbolt, and violently yanked the heavy door open, expecting to find a panicked face under the porch light. Instead, the frantic pounding stopped the exact millisecond the latch clicked, but there was absolutely nobody standing on the porch steps. I clicked on my high-powered flashlight and swept the beam across the yard. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle, and a thick, dense sheet of gray morning fog was rolling off the pine woods, blanketing the ground. Standing several yards back from the porch, perfectly lined up in the center of the gravel yard, was a massive crowd of men, a literal platoon. They were all dressed identically in simple, pale white military-issue undershirts, completely unbothered by the freezing drizzle. But the detail that made the hair on my neck stand rigidly on end was their headwear. Every single man wore an identical, old-fashioned, olive-drab steel combat helmet from the mid-20th century. Their faces were entirely uniform, cast in heavy gray shadows, standing perfectly motionless in a tight military formation, staring blankly ahead. Nobody was breathing. No steam rose from their lips in the freezing air. Before I could even process the supernatural terror of the sight, the man standing at the very front of the formation stepped forward. His heavy combat boots made absolutely zero sound as they crushed the wet gravel. He stopped just at the edge of the porch light, his eyes completely hidden beneath the deep rim of his heavy steel helmet. When he spoke, his voice carried a sharp, distinct, old-school regional drawl that contrasted sharply with our local dialect. "Is this the residence of Sergeant Arthur? Did he leave the living world on this exact date? He gave us this exact coordinate before he went under. He told us the roll call was tonight, and invited us back for an anniversary gathering. The sheer freezing weight of his hollow voice caused my mind to violently jolt. A sudden spike of pure panic hit my chest like a physical blow, and my vision instantly blurred into blackness. I jolted upright in my own bed, gasping for air as tears of pure terror streamed down my face. I frantically looked around the room. The digital clock on my nightstand read 5:15 a.m. The sky outside was a pale, misty gray, the exact color of the fog from my nightmare. The dream had felt so intensely real, so terrifyingly physical, that I could still smell the distinct aroma of wet earth and copper in the air. Unable to calm my racing heart, I threw off the covers and walked down to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. To my shock, the kitchen lights were already blazing, casting a warm yellow glow across the floor. My sister was standing at the counter, surrounded by massive metal pots, boiling pans, and an overwhelming mountain of fresh ingredients. She was aggressively chopping vegetables, systematically preparing a massive multi-course feast. "What on earth are you doing up so early?" I asked, my voice raspy and trembling. My sister turned to look at me, her eyes tired but intensely focused. "Today is the official death anniversary of Arthur," she said, gesturing toward the memorial mantelpiece in the living room. "I wanted to get a head start on preparing his favorite traditional family dishes for the memorial dinner tonight." The blood drained completely from my face. My hands began to shake so violently I had to set my glass down on the counter. "What did you say his name was? Arthur? Your late father-in-law?" I sat her down at the kitchen table and recounted every single detail of my midnight nightmare. The frantic backdoor pounding, the silent platoon of pale-shirted men wearing vintage steel combat helmets standing in the fog, and the precise, chilling words spoken by the leader regarding the anniversary roll call. My sister dropped her knife onto the cutting board, her face turning a ghastly, clinical white. She turned slowly and stared out the kitchen window toward the silent, foggy pine woods behind the house. "Arthur was a platoon sergeant in the war," she whispered, her voice choking with emotion. "Almost his entire unit was wiped out overseas decades ago. He survived, but he carried their names with him until the day he died. He always used to tell his son that a true soldier never breaks a rendezvous, no matter what." A heavy, suffocating wave of realization crashed over both of us. These entities hadn't marched out of the woods to terrify our family or violate our home. They were simply responding to a spiritual invitation sent out by their old commander from the other side. "You need to cook an extra plate," I told her, looking her dead in the eye. "A massive, overflowing plate of every single dish you are making today. And we need to pour a silver cup of his favorite aged whiskey. Before the sun sets tonight, we are leaving it right outside the rear porch threshold." We spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, tense paranoia. We prepared the family memorial inside, but at exactly 5 p.m., as the sun began to dip below the pine trees, my sister and I walked down to the heavy oak cellar door. We placed a heavy ceramic plate piled high with warm food and a brimful cup of whiskey directly on the concrete step outside the threshold. We closed the door, threw the heavy iron deadbolt, locked every window in the annex, and retreated to the front wing of the house for the night. We never heard a single knock that evening. The frantic pounding never returned, and the oppressive, heavy atmosphere inside the connecting corridor strangely lifted, replaced by a quiet, respectful stillness. The next morning, at dawn, I forced my shaking legs to walk back down to the rear porch door to retrieve the dishes. The heavy ceramic plate was sitting exactly where we had left it on the concrete step. The portions of food were entirely untouched. Local wildlife hadn't dragged any of it away, and there were no tracks left in the thick morning dew. But when I reached down and lifted the silver cup to pour out the whiskey, the container was bone dry, entirely empty, leaving only the faint, sweet, metallic aroma of aged alcohol lingering on the cold metal. We still live in that historic colonial estate, and the warm, peaceful atmosphere has fully returned to our family. My sister still cooks her traditional meals every autumn, and my mind belongs completely to me. But every morning at exactly 5 a.m., when the gray fog rolls off the pine woods and blankets the gravel yard, I find myself standing quietly by the kitchen window, staring out at the empty porch step. I don't see shadows, and I don't hear boots on the gravel, but I am permanently paralyzed by a freezing late-night dread, because I know that while we sleep in total safety, our home has officially been marked as the permanent meeting ground for a platoon that refuses to ever truly die.